I am building shelf-style benchwork for the upper deck of the expansion to my layout on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure to subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Those of you who follow my channel know that I've been in the process of building an expansion to my layout. 2 decks, each about 12 feet in length, added on to the central part of my total layout over an area that used to be our family room. In a previous video, I built the benchwork for the lower deck, which was open grid style benchwork. Today, I'm going to be working on the benchwork for the upper deck, which is a shelf style hung from shelf brackets, and I want to get that in place so that as I build my helix in a few days, I'll know exactly where it needs to begin and where it needs to end in order to match up with the 2 decks of the layout. So I wanted to share with you how I build this shelf-style benchwork. It's exactly like the benchwork that holds the upper deck of my existing layout all the way around. I want to show you exactly how I build it. So let's head on over to that part of the layout and we'll get started. Visit our sponsor, Midwest Model Railroad. Their new location with 5,500 square feet of inventory and next-day shipping make them your premier model railroad destination. MidwestModelRR.com. Link in the description. I'm ready to start installing the benchwork for the upper deck of the layout, and of course this is going to be a shelf-type layout. And as is true with my existing upper deck, it's going to be supported by shelf brackets like these right here. These are very strong, very sturdy shelf brackets. And the ones that I am using are, they measure 11 inches by 13.5 inches, and I'll be hanging them with the 13.5 inch portion for the support for the benchwork itself. These are very, very strong and bent steel, formed steel shelf brackets, and they work very well for this. I've used these again on the upper deck of my existing layout, including the area with the mountain scenery, and that area around Rocky Top has plaster of Paris scenery base on it, as well as pounds and pounds and pounds of hydrocal rock casting, and it has never sagged a bit, even though it's been hanging there for several years with all that weight on it. So I'm very confident that these are going to be plenty strong. This area is not going to have nearly that kind of scenery or nearly that kind of weight, so we're going to do very well with these. Now I'll be hanging these from the studs, but before I do, I'm going to be adding some cleats to the studs. And the reason I'm doing that is this. Now, the shelf bracket itself takes up the full width of the stud. The problem is these shelf brackets, the way the steel is formed, it causes some interference with being able to hang a backdrop on the lower deck of the layout. So in order to compensate for that, I want to mount a 1x2 next to each one of the brackets, which will furrow the wall out enough to be able to allow me to mount my backdrop to those 1x2s. And this picture that you're seeing right now is an example of how I've done that on the existing layout. Now, normally, these strips that I'm going to hang, I would use 1x4s, but it just so happened that I had a bunch of 1/2-inch plywood out in my garage that was already ripped down to 3-inch wide strips for another project that I did not too awfully long ago. And I had plenty of these 1/2-inch plywood strips to be able to rip down to do this. So I'm going to be using these. These will work fantastically for this. They're just the right width. So save myself a step that way, used some materials that I already had on hand. Now I've already gone around and used a level to mark the top of the benchwork itself all the way along this wall. Now that's not where I'm going to be mounting the brackets, that's where the top of the benchwork is going to be, but that'll give me a reference line as I get all of these pieces installed. So I'm going to get these cleats installed first, and then we'll come back and work on mounting the shelf brackets and the rest of the benchwork here. Now that I have my cleats all installed, it's time to start installing my shelf brackets. Now, when I install the shelf brackets on the wall, the benchwork, of course, in my case, is going to begin. The basic benchwork is going to be a sheet of plywood, and then we'll have some foam on top of that for the sake of scenery and contours. But in order to mount all of that, I've actually cut some 1x4 cleats that will mount on top of the shelf brackets. This gives me something to screw my plywood into, and they also extend just a little bit beyond the end of the shelf bracket, which is going to give me a place to mount my lighting whenever that comes whenever we get to that part of the layout. Also then, ultimately I'm going to install a board for fascia on the front of this, but we'll do that in just a few moments. Now it's time to get the shelf brackets on. I'll use one of these cleats in order to help me get those positioned accurately, and I'm going to be mounting the shelf brackets with larger screws. The cleats I mounted with just 1-inch drywall screws, which are plenty to hold the cleats up. The cleats themselves will actually only be holding up the backdrop. The shelf brackets themselves, I want to actually mount through that cleat into the studs themselves. So I'll be using 2-inch screws to mount these to the wall. Let's get these up, and this is going to go pretty quickly at this point. Now, I'm going to use these little 1/2-inch cabinet door screws to attach these cleats to the tops of the shelf brackets that I just installed, and these are what I'll be using to actually mount all of the rest of the layout onto the upper deck of the layout. Now, one thing to be aware of whenever you're using shelf brackets as the support for your benchwork, and that is the fact that many of these shelf brackets tend to come shaped in such a way as to create a slight back angle for the shelf. That's so items that are put on shelves don't roll off the front of the shelf and break. So in order to get a nice level benchwork from front to back, you can do one of two things. You can either use some shims behind the top of the brackets in order to level them out, or in my case, I simply put a little pressure on them and just bend them slightly. They are strong enough that I'm not going to bend them enough to weaken them, but I can bend them just enough to get them level. And that gives me a really good, still very strong bench work, but bench work that's nice and level and ready to go. So I'm checking each one of these to make sure they're nice and level from front to back and adjusting them to get them exactly the way I need them to be. Back in here in the very far corner against the wall, I have this bracket that is kind of bridging the end of the new part of the layout over to the existing part of the layout. There's no bracket right against the wall, no bracket coming out from here. So literally what I've done is I've got a couple of 1x4 cleats, and I've marked exactly where they need to go on these on this furring strip and on the stud in the corner. And I'm just going to screw those in here like so, and allow the plywood part of the benchwork to rest on those to support them back against the wall. Now that I've got all of my shelf brackets up, I've got these cleats on top, the cleats on the studs. I've got some long 1x4s that I'm going to put up on the front here that will kind of tie all of these stringers together, and will also give me a nice mounting point for my fascia and anything that I want to hang from the fascia as we go forward. I ripped a sheet of plywood down to 16 inches wide for the support layer for my bench work, and screwed it to my stringers with 1¼ screws, countersinking them just flush with or just below the surface of the plywood. I started installing the plywood at the far end of the benchwork because I knew that I would need to measure and cut my plywood into an L shape where it joined the existing layout, and I knew this would be easier and would waste less plywood if I made the cut of the L on the smaller section. I measured and cut the basic rectangular piece first, then scribed it to match the cuts that I would need to make for it to fit the benchwork and the joint with the existing layout. When I was satisfied with the fit, I screwed it in place just as I had the previous section. I then used my car vac to clean up the sawdust and other debris. Well, the bench work is looking pretty good, but one more step that I want to do today, and that is this particular area of my layout is going to be modeling North Texas. That part of the world is fairly flat and a little desert-like, but nonetheless we're going to want to add a little bit of scenic interest, and so we want to be able to make some contours here. So I'm going to begin with a layer of 1/2-inch extruded foam that I'm going to go ahead and put down on this part of the bench work, and all of the track and scenery will go on top of that. That'll allow me to contour down a little bit, and 1/2 inch can be a significant amount in scale, but it'll also allow me to build up further in the background as I get ready to do that part of the scenery. So I've got a sheet of 1/2-inch foam. I'm going to get it out here, mark it, cut it, get it glued down on this, and I think that will wrap us up for today. I was going to go ahead and glue down this foam to the upper deck of the layout, but as I went to do so, I realized that I didn't have any foam-safe adhesive. I had some liquid nails construction adhesive, but I didn't have any liquid nails for projects. The regular construction adhesive is not foam-safe. It will literally eat all the way through 1/2-inch foam very, very quickly. So make sure whatever adhesive you use whenever you're gluing down foam on bench work or gluing foam to other pieces of foam, be sure and use an adhesive that is foam safe. Liquid nails for projects happens to be a foam safe adhesive, and that's what I prefer to use whenever gluing foam to wood on my layout. But apart from that, I think this is looking really, really good, and I've got everything in place that I need now to be able to build the helix to connect the two decks, and I'm very excited about that. I'm still in the process of kind of laying out exactly how the track work is going to be on this upper deck. As you can see from the photo that I took and shared with you, it's going to have the town of Bowie here on one end. The rest of it's going to be kind of open country scenery of North Texas, and I'm going to figure out exactly how the track needs to run in order to look right and look good on that section of the layout, but also connect into the existing track work over by Wichita Falls. We'll talk about all of that in a future video. Well, if you'd like to see how I built the open grid bench work for the lower deck of this layout, I made a video about it, and you'll find it in the link in the corner of your screen right now. Be sure and take a moment to check out the description down below and see there my Amazon page and the link to my Amazon pick of the week, as well as my Micromark promo code that can save you 10% on regularly priced items at micromark.com, and tons of other great links that you will benefit from and enjoy. Be sure and check those out. Well, if you'd like some more Model Railroad content right now, check out the links on your screen. And be sure and join me each Tuesday as I bring you even more great Model Railroad videos. And I look forward to seeing you then. 10, Lizzie?